The other day in class, we did this analogy experiment of trying to replicate, at least in this setting, of Rutherford's famous experiment. Now, I'm not going to go into detail about Rutherford's experiment. That's going to be for class time. But what I am going to try and do is replicate the experiment you guys did, provide a little bit of an analysis, and this will hopefully provide a nice foundation for how we go about discussing and talking about Rutherford's experiment. Okay? So what am I trying to do in this experiment? Right here is a board that I cannot see through. I have a path that my pennies can travel through. In other words, the pennies cannot go outside of this path. They have to stay somewhere in this path. And my main question is what's behind that board, right? Is there nothing behind that board? Is there an object that's, the size of this entire path length, this path width behind the board? Is the object this big? Is it this big? Is the object very massive? Is the object not very massive? So simply by shooting pennies at it, I'm going to try and figure out something about what's behind this board. It doesn't even need to be one object. Do I think that there's two objects or four objects or whatever? Okay. So simply by doing that, I'm going to try and figure out what's behind this board. Okay. So I'm going to start firing pennies at it. As you guys know, there's a little slot underneath here that because the board is sitting on top of the meter sticks, there's a little slot underneath here so that the pennies can go and just seemingly disappear behind there. Okay, so even though you might not be able to see the pennies, maybe you can hear them. I'll try to guide you, at least with my voice, while I'm shooting them. Now I'm going to try to shoot them randomly the best I can within the path length. And what you notice is the vast majority of them are simply going to go through. Now the one that I had just shot a little bit ago, if you noticed, it all of a sudden just kind of came back. It's sitting right back here. It didn't come back straight at me, but it came back at sort of an angle. Okay, now I'm going to keep doing that. Again, the vast majority of them are going through. So far we've only had one come back. A second one just came back at a similar angle, a little bit smaller of an angle. Another one just came back right there, except this one it went over there. I'm going to keep firing. Maybe I'll do like 10 more or something like that. Okay, continuing with the idea that the vast majority of them are going straight through. That one came back very hard, and it came back even further. And I'll shoot, let's just say 3 more, 4 more. Last one. Okay, the vast majority of them went through. Now I shot, I have no idea, maybe 30, 40 pennies. Okay, of that total amount, only 4 pennies bounced back. Now they didn't bounce back all at the same angle. They didn't bounce back all at the same distance. But this does give me an idea about the fact that, first off, there's definitely an object behind there. An object has to be behind there in order to explain the fact that these pennies have just sort of rejected and came back at me. Now, what can I conclude about that object? Well, because the vast majority of them just simply went through, that means the object is most likely rather small, at least relative to the path width that I have here, which means the rest of the path width, that does not include the object directly behind this board, is simply empty space. That's what it is. The penny did not come back at me because it just simply went through. It's empty space. Okay? Now, as far as the mass of the object that's behind that board, I'm going to say it's rather massive, and here's why. If the object behind that board, which we already know is small because the vast majority of the pennies went through, and therefore the vast majority of this path width is empty space behind the board. In addition to it being small, if it were the mass of the penny, I would expect that if the penny did hit the object, it would just simply transfer its energy into the object, that this penny might just stop, and then the object maybe would keep going. But I certainly wouldn't expect it to just bounce back at me. If it did, maybe a little bit. But I'm going to say that it's much, based on what I saw here, and especially because this one bounced back so far, I'm going to go ahead and say that the object behind there is pretty massive. Now, much more massive than this penny. In order to be much more massive, having it be much more massive helps explain why the pennies came back in the first place. Okay? So 2 main things that I can at least figure out about this object. It's small relative to the path width here, okay? And it's much more massive than the penny itself, okay? So if I go behind the board and I actually take out the object. Okay, here's the object that I had. It was a big weight. This weight right here. See the size of them. Now this is much smaller than the width of this. The diameter of this is much smaller than the width of the path width that I had right here, which is something that I predicted earlier. And this is about 1,000 grams. Okay, and a penny is just I think it's 2.5 grams. So it's much less massive than the object itself. And I could figure all that out simply by shooting pennies at it. I didn't have to see the object or anything like that. You don't need to actually see something. And so indirectly, I could determine the fact that the object that was behind the board is much more massive and it's very small. Okay, so having these notions is going to provide us, I think, again, with a good foundation going into Rutherford's experiment. So use this analysis to answer some of the questions from your packet that I gave you the other day when you actually did this experiment. Okay, so I hope that helps. If you have questions, ask in class, but we'll get started right away on the Rutherford experiment.